Vampire King's son was born deaf until a shy waitress pulled out one thing that made him freeze. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Lucian Blackwood had ruled for centuries with a composure carved from stone, and yet nothing in his long, disciplined existence had prepared him for the quiet wait that sat beside him every evening at the obsidian dining table. His son, Elias Blackwood, 7 years old by human counting, pale even by vampire standards, sat perfectly still as crystal glasses chimed and velvet curtains whispered in the circulating air. The boy's eyes followed movement rather than sound, tracking lips, hands, shadows, anything that might explain a world he could not hear. Born deaf, the heir to the Vampire King had arrived into immortality wrapped in silence, and no ritual, physician, or ancient text had changed that truth. The court knew the facts, though none dared speak them aloud, and Lucian felt their glances like a cold draft whenever Elias failed to react to a voice raised or a laugh shared. Tonight was no different. The hall glowed with candlelight reflected off marble floors, the distance from throne to table measured in careful steps that servants took without ever lifting their eyes. Among them moved Anna Miller, a shy waitress hired through a temporary agency that serviced the outer districts, her uniform neat but plain, her hands steady from years of learning not to draw attention. She had been told only what was necessary: serve quietly, move to the left, never speak unless addressed, and above all never touch the child. Anna obeyed every rule except the one her instincts refused to recognize. From the moment she noticed Elias, she sensed a loneliness deeper than the room's vast ceiling, a stillness that did not match a child's nature. When a polished spoon slipped from the boy's fingers and clinked softly against the floor, heads turned and then turned away again, embarrassed by the sound. But Elias did not flinch. Anna did. She paused, heart tightening, realizing what the others missed. Sound meant nothing to him. She knelt, retrieving the spoon, and without thinking raised her hand in a gentle motion, a small, deliberate gesture meant to reassure. Elias looked at her, really looked, his attention locking onto her fingers as if they were suddenly the most important thing in the room. Anna hesitated, then slowly repeated the motion, shaping it into a simple greeting she had learned years ago from her grandmother's old notebook, something used when words were unnecessary. The air seemed to thin. Elias's expression changed, confusion giving way to recognition, his shoulders relaxing as his gaze followed every movement. At the head of the table, Lucian Blackwood froze. His hand tightened imperceptibly around his glass, not from anger, not from fear, but from a memory he had buried beneath centuries of duty. The gesture Anna had used was not modern sign language, not anything taught in human schools. It was older, rarer, something once reserved for royal bloodlines when silence was a weapon and compassion a secret language. Lucian had not seen it since his own childhood, since a time when his mother had spoken to him without sound in a world that punished vulnerability. Across the table, Elias lifted his small hand and copied Anna's movement perfectly. For the first time in his life, the boy smiled, and the Vampire King understood that everything in his carefully controlled world was about to change. The hall did not erupt, did not whisper, did not react the way it usually did when something unusual occurred. Instead, it settled into a tense stillness as if the walls themselves were listening. Lucian Blackwood did not move at first. He watched his son with a focus that stripped the room of everything else, noting the way Elias leaned forward slightly, eyes bright, hands lifting again with careful precision to mirror Anna Miller's motion. The boy's breathing slowed, shoulders no longer drawn tight, and for Lucian that small change carried more weight than any prophecy or omen. For 7 years, Elias had existed behind glass, present but unreachable, surrounded by voices that meant nothing to him, smiles that never quite reached him, and rituals that failed to bridge the gap. Now a human waitress stood less than 3 feet away, her posture modest, her expression uncertain, and yet she had reached him without sound. Anna felt the shift before she understood it. The attention in the room pressed against her skin, not hostile, not welcoming, simply immense. She became aware of her own heartbeat, steady but loud in her ears, and she lowered her hands instinctively, unsure if she had crossed an invisible line. Elias made a soft sound in his throat, not a word, not a cry, but something warm and unguarded, and he reached for her again, small fingers hovering in the air as if asking permission. Anna smiled before she could stop herself and repeated the gesture more slowly, the way her grandmother had taught her when patience mattered more than precision. She did not know she was using a form refined centuries ago, only that it felt right, that the boy was watching her hands the way someone listens to music. Lucien rose from his chair. The movement was controlled, measured, but it sent a ripple through the assembled nobles who straightened without thinking. He crossed the distance between them in a few long steps, stopping close enough that Anna could sense the cold clarity of his presence without looking up. His gaze remained on Elias. Up close, he could see the details others missed, the way his son's pupils adjusted to motion, the faint tremor in his fingers as he signed back, imperfect but earnest. Lucien remembered a different room, smaller, lit by oil lamps, where his own mother had once stilled his fears with the same motions after a long night of lessons and expectations. He had buried that memory because it hurt, because it reminded him of softness he could not afford. Now it stood before him in borrowed hands. Around them, the court waited, unsure whether to breathe. Anna finally lifted her eyes and met Lucien's gaze, expecting reprimand, perhaps dismissal, but what she saw there was not anger. It was restraint holding back something vast. She lowered her head slightly, a reflex from years of service, and stepped back half a pace, but Elias reached out and caught the edge of her sleeve, anchoring her in place. The contact was gentle, unquestioned. Lucien spoke, his voice calm, steady, carrying without force, instructing the servants to clear the table and give the child space. No one argued. As the room slowly emptied, the weight shifted from spectacle to intimacy, from observation to consequence. Anna remained where she was, unsure why her legs would not move, while Elias continued to sign, slower now, more confident, and Lucien understood with unsettling clarity that something ancient had been awakened, not by magic, not by blood, but by recognition. Lucien Blackwood did not ask Anna Miller to follow him, yet she found herself doing so as naturally as breathing, guided by nothing more than the quiet authority in his presence and the small hand of Elias still holding her sleeve. They moved into a smaller sitting chamber adjacent to the hall, a room softened by tall windows and heavy drapes where candlelight rested instead of flickered. The doors closed without a sound, sealing them away from the court and its expectations. Elias released Anna only after she sat beside him on a low velvet bench, his legs swinging slightly above the floor, his attention never leaving her hands. Lucien stood across from them, arms loosely at his sides, watching not as a king, but as a father measuring something fragile. Anna felt the silence differently here. It was not empty. It was shared. She lifted her hands again, slower now, forming simple shapes, gestures meant to ask how he felt, whether he was comfortable, whether he wanted to continue. Elias responded carefully, his movements less precise but full of intent, and each exchange pulled him further out of the invisible shell that had defined his life. Lucien observed the pattern forming, the rhythm of connection, and realized with a quiet ache that his son had never been taught how to exist without strain until this moment. For years, tutors had tried to make Elias adapt to a hearing world, focusing on correction instead of understanding, progress instead of peace. Anna offered none of that. She adjusted herself instead, meeting the child where he was. Minutes passed, then more, measured not by clocks, but by the ease settling into Elias's posture. Lucien finally spoke, his voice low and even, asking Anna where she had learned to communicate this way. She hesitated before answering, her fingers pausing midair, then lowered her hands respectfully. She explained that her grandmother had raised her after her parents passed, that the woman had kept old notebooks filled with symbols and notes, never explaining their origin, only insisting they mattered. Anna had practiced them as a child without knowing why, drawn to the quiet clarity of expression without sound. Lucien listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but something inside him shifted with each word. He recognized the description, the careful preservation of knowledge disguised as something harmless, something human. When Anna finished, she waited, prepared for dismissal, perhaps questioning. Instead, Lucien nodded once and turned his attention back to Elias, who had grown restless from the pause. He knelt in front of his son, lowering himself to eye level, and for the first time attempted the gestures himself, imperfect, hesitant. Elias's eyes widened, then softened, and he corrected his father gently, guiding Lucien's hands into the right shape. The sight struck deeper than any victory Lucien had known. A king learning from his child. A child teaching without sound. Anna watched, heart steady, sensing she was witnessing something sacred without fully understanding why. Outside the chamber, the court waited, but inside, time bent around a simple truth forming quietly between three lives. Lucien rose at last and addressed Anna with measured calm, informing her that she would remain at the castle for the foreseeable future, not as a servant bound by silence, but as someone essential to his son's well-being. There was no threat in his tone, no command disguised as kindness. It was a statement shaped by necessity and something closer to trust. Anna accepted with a nod, not out of fear, but because Elias reached for her again, his fingers warm and certain. And in that moment she understood that whatever path had brought her here was no longer hers alone to walk. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the castle in long, pale bands, touching stone that had not changed in centuries, and Anna Miller woke with the unfamiliar sense that the silence around her was intentional rather than lonely. She had been given a small guest room near the inner gardens, simple but warm, and when she stepped into the corridor, she found Elias already waiting, seated on a cushioned bench with his feet swinging, eyes fixed on the far end of the hall. He noticed her instantly and smiled, rising to greet her with the careful hand movements they now shared, slower than before, but more confident. Anna returned the greeting, her own nerves settling as familiarity replaced uncertainty. Lucien Blackwood watched from a distance, partially obscured by a stone arch, noting how his son moved more freely this morning, shoulders relaxed, steps lighter, as if the weight he carried had shifted overnight. The routine that followed felt quietly revolutionary. Instead of tutors crowding Elias with expectations, the boy spent the early hours with Anna in the garden room, sunlight warming the floor as she taught him signs for ordinary things, water, leaf, sky. While he responded with enthusiasm that bordered on laughter, his expressions vivid and unrestrained. Lucien remained present but unobtrusive, seated a few yards away, observing how his son learned not by force but by joy. The change did not go unnoticed. Servants passing by slowed their steps. Advisors lingered longer than necessary. Whispers began, not cruel, but uncertain, carried on looks exchanged behind careful hands. A human in the inner wing was unprecedented, and one allowed such closeness to the air unsettled the balance the court relied upon. By midday, Lucien convened a small council, their meeting brief but tense, questions framed as concern, curiosity disguised as caution. He answered little, stating only that his son had shown improvement and that Anna Miller would remain under his protection. No one challenged him openly, but the air held resistance like a held breath. Back in the garden room, Elias grew tired, his focus drifting as the afternoon wore on. Anna guided him gently to rest, her gestures slower now, comforting rather than instructive. Elias leaned against her side without hesitation, his head resting against her arm, trusting in a way that made Lucien look away for a moment, his composure cracking just enough to remind him of what had been missing all these years. When Elias finally slept, Lucien approached, his movements quiet, and thanked Anna with a nod that carried more weight than words. He asked her, carefully, if she understood the significance of what she had brought back into his son's life. Anna answered honestly that she did not, only that she believed no child should feel unheard. The simplicity of her response struck him harder than any accusation. As evening approached, the castle shifted again, preparations beginning for another formal gathering, and Lucien knew the scrutiny would intensify. He instructed that Anna would attend, not as staff, but as a guest seated near Elias, a decision that sent ripples through the household. Anna felt the pressure building but steadied herself by Elias's calm presence, his small, hand finding hers as they prepared to return to the grand hall. Lucien took his place beside them, aware that by choosing this path, he was altering more than tradition. He was choosing connection over distance, trust over control, and for the first time in centuries, the future did not feel like something to endure, but something to protect. The grand hall transformed as dusk settled, candlelight blooming against dark stone and polished floors until the space felt both intimate and immense, and Anna Miller felt every step as she entered beside Elias, her posture steady despite the weight of watching eyes. Lucien Blackwood walked on the boy's other side, his presence an unspoken shield, and together they approached the long table prepared for the evening gathering. Elias took his seat without hesitation, his fingers brushing Anna's hand once before resting on the table, a small reassurance that steadied them both. As guests arrived, their movements slowed when they noticed the arrangement, curiosity rippling through expressions carefully schooled to neutrality. Conversation resumed in measured tones, yet the undercurrent of attention never fully lifted. Anna focused on Elias, signing quietly as he asked about the lights, the patterns in the ceiling, the way reflections moved across crystal. She answered patiently, keeping her gestures clear and calm, aware that Lucien watched every exchange with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The meal progressed without incident until a subtle pause spread across the room, prompted not by sound but by stillness. Elias had lifted his hands, initiating a question more complex than before, his movements hesitant yet deliberate, asking why people spoke so much if words could be missed. Anna considered, then reached into the small satchel she had been allowed to carry, her fingers brushing a familiar texture. She drew out a folded page, yellowed at the edges, covered in careful sketches and notes, the same notebook leaf her grandmother had once pressed into her hands with a quiet smile. She smoothed it on the table and pointed to the symbols, explaining through signs that some messages were meant to last longer than voices, meant to be seen and remembered. Elias leaned closer, absorbing every detail, and then Lucien stopped breathing. The markings were unmistakable. They were not merely instructions or lessons, but a codified system, an early version of the silent language used by the royal line long before treaties and courts, before power learned to announce itself. He recognized a specific sigil near the margin, one associated with a vow of guardianship, a promise recorded only once, centuries ago, when a mortal ally had sworn to protect knowledge that could not survive among the ambitious. Lucien's hand hovered over the page without touching it, his control holding as memories aligned with possibility. Across the table, a senior advisor shifted, sensing the change, but Lucien did not look away from the notebook. He met Anna's eyes for the first time fully and asked, evenly, where her grandmother had obtained these pages. Anna signed her answer carefully, explaining that the notebook had been passed down with no explanation beyond the instruction to keep it safe, to use it kindly, and to never sell it, no matter the need. The room felt smaller, the candles steadier, as if waiting. Elias watched his father, confusion giving way to curiosity as Lucien finally nodded, understanding settling like a decision made long ago. He closed the notebook gently and slid it back toward Anna, then addressed the room with calm authority, stating that the evening would conclude early and that no discussion of what had been seen would leave these walls. The order was accepted without protest. As the hall emptied, Elias reached for the notebook again, signing a simple thank you that Anna returned with a smile. Lucien remained standing, his gaze distant yet resolved, knowing that the thing she had pulled from her satchel had not only bridged silence for his son, but reopened a path sealed by time, and that from this moment forward, the fate of his house was no longer his alone to carry. The castle settled into a quieter rhythm after the hall emptied, corridors echoing with softer steps as servants withdrew and lamps were lowered to a gentler glow, and Lucien Blackwood guided Anna and Elias toward the inner wing reserved for private family hours. Elias walked between them, posture relaxed, his attention shifting easily from the patterned rugs beneath his feet to the play of light along the walls, as if the building itself had become something he could finally explore rather than endure. When they reached the study adjoining the family quarters, Lucien closed the door, and the quiet that followed felt intentional, protective. He gestured for Anna to sit with Elias near the low table by the window, then took a seat opposite them, his hands folded loosely, eyes steady. He spoke slowly, deliberately, asking Anna to tell him everything she remembered about her grandmother, not as a command but as an invitation. Anna gathered her thoughts and signed while speaking softly, explaining that her grandmother had been a meticulous woman who valued patience and discretion, who taught her that knowledge carried responsibility and that kindness was the safest way to hold it. She described evenings spent tracing symbols by lamplight, the insistence on accuracy, the rule that nothing learned in silence should be used to dominate another. Lucien listened, recognizing the echoes of an oath long forgotten by most, one designed to keep power from devouring itself. Elias watched the exchange, occasionally interjecting with small signs of his own, asking questions about the past, about why secrets existed, about whether silence could be strong. Anna answered each one, shaping her hands carefully so meaning remained clear, and Lucien felt something ease in his chest as he realized his son was not merely absorbing information, but forming a sense of self grounded in understanding rather than absence. As the evening deepened, Lucien rose and retrieved a slim ledger from a hidden shelf, placing it on the table between them. He did not open it. He simply acknowledged that the symbols in Anna's notebook matched records his family had guarded for generations, and that her grandmother had likely been entrusted with a fragment to preserve when the court grew careless. There was no accusation in his tone, only recognition. He assured Anna that her presence here was no longer provisional, that she would be granted a protected role focused solely on Elias's growth and comfort, free from the rigid expectations imposed by tradition. Anna accepted quietly, aware that the weight of the offer exceeded any contract she had known, yet feeling grounded by the sincerity behind it. Elias reached for the ledger, curiosity bright, and Lucien smiled faintly as he signed a promise to teach his son at his own pace, without forcing him into a world not built for him. Later, as Elias grew drowsy, Anna helped guide him toward rest, their shared language carrying him gently into sleep. Lucien watched from the doorway, noting the calm that lingered even after the boy's eyes closed, a peace he had once believed unattainable. When Anna returned, he thanked her again, this time with words that carried humility rather than authority, and acknowledged that trust, once given, demanded consistency. Outside, the castle remained vigilant, its ancient stones bearing witness to a quiet shift that could not be undone. Within, a king, a child, and a woman bound by kindness understood that the future had begun to speak without sound, and that listening would require courage as much as power. By the third morning, the shift within the castle could no longer be mistaken for coincidence, and Lucien Blackwood felt at the moment he entered the eastern gallery to find members of the inner council already assembled without summons. Their posture was composed, their expressions carefully neutral, yet the tension beneath was unmistakable. He acknowledged them with a measured nod and took his place at the head of the table, fully aware that Anna Miller and his son had become the unspoken subject before a word was exchanged. The council spoke in practiced tones, concerns framed as protocol, questions disguised as loyalty, emphasizing tradition, balance, and the risks of allowing a human such proximity to the royal line. Lucien listened without interruption, his composure steady, while their words revealed what silence could not. Fear of change, fear of loss of control, fear that something ancient had been awakened without their consent. When he finally responded, his voice carried calm authority, stating that Elias's progress was undeniable, that the boy had slept peacefully, communicated freely, and shown curiosity rather than withdrawal, developments no ritual or specialist had achieved in years. The council exchanged glances, some skeptical, others unsettled by the truth they could not refute. Lucien reminded them that the purpose of power was preservation, not stagnation, and that protecting his son outweighed preserving comfort. The discussion ended without formal resolution, but the lines had been drawn. Elsewhere in the castle, Anna sensed the shift long before she understood it. Servants who had once smiled softly now watched with guarded curiosity, steps slowing when she passed, whispers trailing behind careful hands. She remained focused on Elias, guiding him through lessons by the window, introducing new signs for emotion, patience, and choice, watching his confidence grow with each successful exchange. Elias responded eagerly, his movements less tentative, his expressions more animated, as if the world had expanded beyond observation into participation. Lucien observed from a distance, pride tempered by awareness that resistance would soon surface more directly. That afternoon, a formal request arrived from the council, inviting Anna to attend a private inquiry, phrased politely, yet unmistakably official. Lucien intercepted it, informing Anna with transparency rather than reassurance, and asked whether she felt prepared to answer questions she had never anticipated. Anna considered carefully, then nodded, her resolve grounded not in ambition but in responsibility to the child who trusted her. When the inquiry convened, Anna stood alone before a semicircle of elders, her posture respectful, her hands steady. They questioned her upbringing, her grandmother, her intentions, probing for hidden motives, alliances, ambitions. Anna answered honestly, explaining that she had sought only to be kind, to listen where others had not, to offer Elias a way to be understood rather than corrected. She admitted she had not known the value of the symbols she carried, only that they mattered to the people who needed them. Her sincerity unsettled the room more than any defiance could have. Lucien watched from the shadows, prepared to intervene, but the council found no leverage in her words. When the session concluded, no verdict was issued, only a warning veiled as advice, urging caution in disrupting long-held order. That evening, as Anna returned to Elias, who greeted her with an enthusiastic series of signs asking where she had been, Lucien recognized that the true conflict was no longer external. The castle stood at the edge of transformation, and whether it resisted or adapted would determine not only the fate of his son, but the future of a world that had forgotten how to listen. The days that followed unfolded with a careful balance, as if the castle itself were learning new steps, and Lucien Blackwood sensed that the moment for quiet preparation had arrived. He began inviting Anna into spaces previously closed to anyone outside the bloodline, not as a test, but as acknowledgement that understanding could no longer remain fragmented. In the Western Archive, where tall shelves held records older than most nations, Lucien retrieved volumes written in layered scripts and placed them within Anna's reach, explaining their purpose with calm precision. Elias sat between them on the floor, attentive and curious, his hands moving eagerly as Anna translated complex ideas into shapes he could grasp. Lucien watched his son engage with history not as an obligation, but as an inheritance made accessible, and the realization settled that legacy did not require sound to endure. One afternoon, while light filtered through high windows, Anna noticed a recurring symbol etched into the margins of several texts, matching a mark from her grandmother's notebook. She paused, tracing the shape with her finger, and Lucien recognized it instantly as a designation once used for trusted intermediaries between worlds. He explained that long ago, before fear hardened borders, there were humans invited into the court not as servants, but as bridges, chosen for restraint and empathy rather than strength. Anna listened, understanding dawning not as pride, but as responsibility. Elias followed the exchange closely, his questions precise, asking whether bridges could break and whether they could be rebuilt. Anna answered honestly that they could, but only if people chose to walk toward one another. That evening, Lucien convened a smaller gathering, not the full council but those willing to listen, and introduced Anna formally as Elias's guide and guardian in matters of communication. The announcement was met with measured reactions, skepticism softened by the undeniable change in the child seated calmly beside her. Elias demonstrated his progress with simple signs, his confidence steady, and the room responded with a silence that carried respect rather than doubt. Lucien did not argue for acceptance. He allowed evidence to speak. Afterward, as the castle settled, Elias tugged gently at Anna's sleeve and signed a question that caught both adults off guard, asking whether he would always need someone else to speak for him. Anna knelt to his level and replied that he would not, that his voice already existed, and that learning to use it in many ways would make him stronger, not dependent. Lucien watched his son absorb the answer, seeing the seeds of independence take root, and felt gratitude sharpen into resolve. That night, Lucien made a decision that would ripple outward, ordering the establishment of a new program within the court dedicated to silent communication and inclusive learning, opened first to his son, then to others who had been overlooked. The announcement was quiet, deliberate, framed as evolution rather than reform, but its implications were profound. As Anna prepared Elias for rest, signing a story passed down through her family about patience and trust, Lucian stood at the threshold, aware that the resistance he feared had not vanished, only shifted. Yet the foundation was set. The truth had surfaced not through force or decree, but through understanding reclaimed. When Elias finally slept, his expression peaceful, Lucian acknowledged that the most powerful change often arrived without sound, and that protecting it would require vigilance, humility, and the courage to let the future speak in its own way. The castle awoke to a morning unlike any before, not marked by ceremony or announcement, but by a subtle harmony that settled into its ancient walls, and Lucian Blackwood sensed that the choice he had made was now irreversible. He stood by the tall window of the east wing, watching light spread across the grounds as Elias and Anna walked slowly along the garden path below, their silhouettes moving in quiet conversation shaped by hands rather than sound. Elias paused often, pointing out details he had once ignored, the way leaves trembled in the breeze, the rhythm of water moving through stone channels, his curiosity no longer constrained by the effort of keeping up with a world that did not wait for him. Anna matched his pace easily, responding with patience that never felt instructional, only present. Lucian felt the weight of centuries settle differently on his shoulders, not as burden, but as context. When they returned indoors, Elias signed a question that surprised him, asking whether the other children of the court would ever learn the way he had. Lucian knelt, meeting his son's gaze, and signed back that they would, if they wished, and that he would make sure the choice existed. Elias nodded, satisfied, as if the matter were settled. The council gathered later that day, their presence formal but subdued, and Lucian addressed them without ceremony, reaffirming his earlier decisions and expanding them, declaring that the court would adapt not because it was forced, but because it was wise. He spoke of continuity through understanding, of strength that did not depend on exclusion, and though not all faces reflected agreement, none could deny the clarity of his resolve. Anna stood quietly at the edge of the chamber, not as an outsider, but not yet as an equal, occupying a space defined by trust rather than title. When the meeting concluded, Lucian approached her and placed the restored notebook back into her care, acknowledging that some things remained safest when held by those who valued them without ambition. Anna accepted with steady hands, understanding the gravity of what was entrusted to her, and Elias reached up to touch the cover, signing that it felt like home. That evening, as the castle settled into its familiar quiet, Elias prepared for rest with an ease that had once seemed impossible, his mind active yet unburdened. Anna signed a final story, one about a bridge that learned it was not meant to move people across it, but to teach them how to meet in the middle. Elias smiled as he drifted to sleep, his breathing even, his expression peaceful. Lucian lingered after Anna stepped away, watching his son rest, aware that the future would bring challenges he could not foresee, resistance that would test his resolve, and choices that would demand sacrifice. Yet for the first time in his long existence, uncertainty did not feel like threat. It felt like possibility. As he extinguished the lamp and closed the door softly, Lucian Blackwood understood that power had never been about control alone, but about listening long enough to be changed, and that the quiet courage of a child and the kindness of a woman had reshaped a kingdom without ever raising a voice.